Good morning. Welcome to this Stream 2 session. My name is Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, a free market think tank. I am not an expert on ports, logistics or transit arrangements whatsoever. My only job is to chair this discussion, but I'm delighted that I'm joined by three people who are experts in this area. So let me introduce our three panellists. And then let me just tell you how we'll spend about the next half hour. I'm going to ask for the panellists to give a couple of minutes of their introductory thoughts. I've got a few extremely difficult questions to put to each of the three of them. And then I hope we'll get equally difficult and challenging questions from the floor. It's always much more constructive when everybody agrees, but it's also much more boring. So I hope we can tease out some areas of disagreement as well. So let me introduce you to the panel. On my immediate left is Rishi Sunak, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Richmond in Yorkshire, and the recent author of The Free Ports Opportunity, a paper he published for the Centre of Policy Studies. And we're delighted, Rishi, you can join us today, having left the campaign trail rather than defending your wafer-thin majority of 19,550 up in Richmond. Next on the panel is Victoria Houston, who is the Senior Counsel for the Legatum Institute's Special Trade Commission and was on the Committee of Lawyers for Britain. And last but by no means least is Sir David Ord, the co-founder and managing director of the Bristol Port Company, a member of the Advisory Council of Open Europe, and he was knighted in the 2017 New Year's Honours List. So I've got to get used to calling you Sir David rather than just David. Obviously, the issue of ports and the challenges, as well as the opportunities for Brexit, we're talking about an area which is really on the coalface of a new global trading Britain. So, Rishi, I wonder if I could start with you on what you see as the challenges and opportunities posed by Brexit, and what sort of new or altered policy framework are we going to need to make the most of a prosperous Britain outside of the European Union. Rishi, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. And as Mark said, I represent Richmond in North Yorkshire, so I'm an odd choice to be on this panel, as it is a completely landlocked constituency. But in any case, I'm a huge fan of ports, and hopefully all of you are as well. They're a slightly unsung hero amongst our industrial sectors, I feel. We hear a lot about our advertising sector, Great British advertising businesses. The port sector, actually, an economic contribution, is very similar in size to our advertising sector, to put it in context for you. We have the second largest port sector in Europe, and unlike some of our European neighbours, it's largely privately owned and privately funded and very efficient. So it's something that hopefully can be a foundation for a lot of economic growth going forward. Vis-a-vis Brexit and changes and opportunities, I'd say three buckets that I would highlight. One is regulatory changes, the second is infrastructure requirements, and the third is opportunities for economic innovation. So briefly on those three, regulatory changes, I think the most obvious is the EU Ports Directive, which no doubt David will talk to, and it's a directive that many of our ports companies argued against. It's not particularly suitable for the UK, so there's an opportunity there to make some changes after we leave. The second, infrastructure requirements. Obviously, there are going to be some changes to our customs arrangements after we leave the EU. I don't think that's something to be particularly fearful of. If you look around the world, there are plenty of trading partners like the US and Canada trading $500 billion of goods every year, New Zealand and Australia, Norway and the EU. None of those trading partners have customs unions. They all trade very seamlessly and efficiently. So, we can do this. The World Bank thinks we're the 5th best country in the world already. So there's a foundation to build on. But obviously, there's more we can do to be best in class. And Victoria probably will touch on some of these things. But for those of you that travel to the US, you might be familiar with the global entry system where you pre-cleared and get fast access. There is an equivalent for customs clearance called AEO. We should expand our program there. We need to invest in our IT systems. I think the third area is most exciting to me, areas for economic innovation. As Mark mentioned, I've been advocating the creation of free ports or free trade zones. Think of these as supercharged enterprise zones created around port areas with lots of benefits of reduced or low tariffs and customs duties layered on with other regulatory and tax incentives. They can really drive economic growth. There are 3,000 of these all over the world. In fact, pretty much the only place you don't find these zones working well is the EU. So again, again, it's an opportunity for us after we leave. And I think part of the name for this panel was industrial strategy, and the government's been clear that its industrial strategy wants to drive up trade, drive up manufacturing, and drive regional growth. If you look at where all our ports are, the vast majority of them are outside of London and the southeast, in areas where we would like to see economic growth, and doing things like free ports and other ideas to boost ports would deliver on the government's industrial strategy. So, I'm excited about the opportunities ahead, and as Mark said, we are on the coalface, so there will be investment required in ensuring that transition is as seamless as it can be.
Rishi, thank you. Victoria.
Thanks. So at the Logisitcs Institute, we've done a lot of work on the issue of ports and customs. We've started from the first principle that for Brexit to be successful, which we think it can be, we must leave the customs union and we must leave the single market. If we don't do those two first steps, then all of our future trade policy falls away, and really the Brexit prizes of both home industrial strategy and international trade policy fall away. Now, clearly, leaving the customs union, leaving the single market has very big implications for how goods get in and out of this country, and port services are right at the very centre of that. So what we need to do is, in order to tackle some of these challenges, which have been highlighted, there's been a lot of scare stories about huge queues at ports and lorries being backed up all the way across the southeast of England. These are real challenges, but they are not insurmountable, with very feasible practical steps that can be taken. And we've outlined some of these in one of our papers on the customs union and movement of goods. Open Europe, who are also involved with this conference, have done a similar piece of work. Rishi mentioned AEOs. This is a very important programme that the government needs to be promoting the uptake of. And there's lots of other solutions that are available through the existing customs processes that the EU operates that really need to be made the most of. And only by doing that and putting these logistical fixes in place can we make sure that these problems and potential issues with movement of goods outside of the customs union are dealt with. But we think that they definitely can be resolved and dealt with, and trade will continue. Trade continues between countries that aren't in customs unions all the time, including between this country and every country in the EU and the rest of the world. So we just need to make sure we keep those seamless customs processes in operation. And that's actually a great opportunity for our ports, services and operators who are already very good at this, and they can really make the most of this opportunity and get even better.
Thank you. So David, opportunities, challenges.
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning. The port industry is not usually in the spotlight at all. It is a kind of taken for granted sector, low profile, which suits myself and my colleagues very well. We try and stay out of the political firmament, and we just get on with the job. 500 million tonnes of goods comes through UK ports. There's about 108 commercial ports. And our world has changed dramatically over the last 25 years. We were very famous as a sector for strikes, particularly in the 70s and 80s. The Blessed Margaret sorted that out, and there was a privatization process which saw a flood of capital flowing into the sector. We are talking billions and billions that have been invested throughout the UK ports, and I would like to think that we are as efficient as any ports other than the Singapores and Hong Kongs. From a productivity perspective, which seems to be flavour of the month, We have absolutely nothing to worry about. We're very investment orientated machinery. Marlon Brando no longer hauls sacks on his shoulders, and we just get on with the job. The EU has tried to disrupt that efficiency over the last 5 years, 10 years actually. It was very irritating for them that we weren't within their scope of authority. They managed to get into all the marine side of life. So we had international organizations organizing and vaguely regulating the marine side. They had UK regulators on that as well, but the EU couldn't stand this, so they put in a whole new layer. So many of the marine safety aspects, security, have actually been organized by Brussels over the last 20 years. We had a fight for 15 years on the Port Services Directive, an unholy alliance between private sector port operators and trade unions managed to defeat this twice in the European Parliament, which has never happened before. Some of the measures in those first two attempts were draconian Soviet style, no other word for it. They had a third attempt and they have now succeeded, and I can go into some of the details later. In terms of the future and Brexit, we are positive, we are confident, and we look forward to the challenge, and we hope very much that whatever deal is reached on trade, the bottom line is that there will be more stuff brought in and exported out.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of our panellists from the chair, but I'm extremely keen to get contributions from the floor. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you're in the first 5 rows, please put up your hand and catch my eye. If you're in the 6th row backwards, I'm extremely short-sighted, so please stand up and wave your arms hysterically, and that will catch my eye. So I'll keep looking out to the audience. I've seen one gentleman already, a couple already. Richie, I wonder if I could come back to you initially, if you could explain a bit more about what this free ports idea is. I mean, you mentioned it's almost ubiquitous across the planet, but it is obviously alien to countries that have been in the EU for the last 40 years or so. So what precisely would happen? You know, how would Bristol or Southampton or, you know, look different if your policies were adopted?
I think for those of you probably pretty familiar with enterprise zones, which is an area, typically an area would bid to be designated an enterprise zone from the government, and they therefore would then receive, that area would receive certain tax and regulatory benefits. You know, a free port or a free trade zone is essentially the same concept. Those benefits relate to customs duties and tariffs. So goods coming into the zone, for example, raw materials to be manufactured into something, and those goods are then re-exported. That entire activity happens outside of the UK's customs territory, so it's not subject to any customs duties or VAT. And for goods that are brought into the UK, there's a reduced tariff schedule, flexibility on when you pay your duties, and the frequency with which you have to file those duties as well. You can layer on top of that the typical benefits that you see in an enterprise zone, you know, R&D tax incentives, potentially planning, fast-track planning approvals. And when you put that package of things together in one area and you allow companies to essentially pre-clear themselves, to avail themselves of all those benefits in advance, then you really reduce the cost of doing business. And that's what we've seen around the world. The US, has close to 200 of these zones. Most of the US car manufacturing happens inside a free trade zone or a free port, and responsible for, I think, close to 1 million jobs in America. So, it's a reasonably simple idea. This is not very novel. It's just doing it here for the first time, I think, would be exciting. And for those ports, particularly near me up in Teesside, where they've got a lot of land that could be used, they're excited about the opportunity of going to overseas manufacturers and saying, come and locate here inside our new free port. All these benefits will be there for you, and that will create jobs in places that we would like to see them.
Rishi, I wonder if I could just on the sort of technical point about how you implement this. I've always said I'm a strong supporter of enterprise zones, but I would only have one, and I would call it the United Kingdom. How do you, if you like, draw the map? I mean, how far inland from the Southampton docks can you be doing this before there's then a sort of cliff edge effect and those benefits aren't reaped in the next, square mile? And does that have a distorting effect? How do you draw these lines around the United Kingdom or around the ports of the United Kingdom?
I think absolutely fair point. There's obviously, an argument for unilateral liberalisation of our import tariff regime, and that is a perfectly economically consistent argument. It's clearly not something that the government has said that it's going to do, and they've said the opposite, that they will adopt our existing EU tariff schedule on the day that we leave. So we will have a regime. So free ports could benefit because they would create space to operate outside of those tariffs. The distortive effect is fair. I think whenever government tries to create economic activity in particular areas or particular sectors, that is of course distortive. And there may be some people in the room who feel we shouldn't do any of that, and I think that's a fair and principled position. But I think the reality of our government and our life is that there are things that we like to support. There are areas of our country that we'd like to see more economic growth in. I think that would be good for the country, and it's also morally right. So trying to find ways to do that which are not super distortive and are not where you get into the habit of picking winners in particular companies or sectors is attractive to me. And free ports are essentially like enterprise zones, a way of saying, look, here's an area that we would like to benefit, and we know that it will typically benefit manufacturing and trade-oriented jobs, which is good, but it's going to be individual businesses and entrepreneurs that themselves have to take advantage of those things. We're not going to pick which companies win and which companies don't.
Sure. Victoria, you said that you were sort of optimistic that we could deal with this, that there are these sort of scare stories that, the day we leave, there will be huge queues and, goods won't flow freely in. Tell us a bit there about why you're optimistic. If our trade arrangements, perhaps not on Brexit +1, or perhaps not on the immediate hour we leave, but over the coming years become more liberalised, but nevertheless more complex, in having a whole range of different relations with a whole range of different countries. Why are you so optimistic that logistically we'll be able to handle that, smoothly?
I think there's in some ways, a quite old-fashioned perception about what trade in goods and customs and borders are like. It's not, as David said, it's not like the olden days of dockers physically unloading goods and filling in reams of paperwork. In modern trade, much of the formalities are actually completed before you even leave the exporting port. Everything's filed online and pre-cleared. The amount of physical checks and inspections of goods coming into the customs union at present is extremely low. I think goods coming from outside the customs union into the UK at present, less than 10% are actually subject to physical checks. A lot less than 10%. And that's the case in most EU countries where they operate actually very efficient border clearance. We are only going to get better at that as more technology solutions are rolled out. Blockchain customs solutions are a huge opportunity that we'll be very well placed to deploy. The Irish border springs to mind as an ideal candidate to really put in place a best-in-class, low-visibility, low-touch customs border, and we can start to really lead the world in that. And that's very much the direction of travel, and it's a huge opportunity for us to do that. Notwithstanding, there will be challenges in minimising the disruptions that we will face on the way to that. I don't want to, gloss over the fact that there are challenges that have to be resolved with the EU. We need to have certain mutual recognition arrangements in place for our authorised economic operators and for standards and certification of goods. But these are very much practical, technical issues that the EU has in place with lots of countries around the world that it doesn't have free trade agreements with, so shouldn't be insurmountable, shouldn't be part of the strategic political battles that might take place.
And David, you mentioned that you'd sort of successfully stopped twice a sort of Soviet-style EU ports directive, and when it's come in, it's been watered down. But could you just say a little bit about what the burden of that is on British ports and what its repeal would look like if we decide to extinguish that directive once we're fully out of the EU?
Absolutely. The EU attitude to ports is based on not understanding that there are two different port models. One is the continental, one is the UK. The laudable aim was to increase competition between ports and within ports. In England or in the UK, my competition is Southampton or Liverpool. In Rotterdam, if I have a container terminal or a forest products terminal, then sometimes I can have exclusive rights given by the state, because the state own the freeholds of most European ports. So I am potentially in a monopoly situation. And the driver to all of this nonsense has been to try and get competition, active competition. In the UK, it is not viable in a lot of our ports to have two competing stevedoring companies or tug companies or pilot companies. But that was the model that they tried to impose on us, that there would be a selection process of operators, and in our case, maybe we were the operator in our port. Somebody else comes in, and the proposal was that we would have to potentially lose our business to that new arrival. Plant, equipment, people, resources would have to be handed over on terms never quite detailed. So those went out of the proposal when the first two proposals were defeated. The current proposal is watered down to a point where, from our perspective, there are some cosmetic stuff that we will have to do. For example, the initial proposal in this round was that all pricing agreements would be in the public sector. So you can imagine how that went down in our competitive world in the UK. Everybody, all our competitors would know our prices. That was taken out on the UK government's wish. So it is now law, or it will come in 2 years, but it's all approved and legal. And it would be our hope that although it's watered down, although it's not critical, the government would seek to delete that from the portfolio of regulations. In passing, I could just comment that I think it's going to be very important for ministers in the government to insist that a real look is taken at a lot of the regulations that have now been or will now come into UK law. The civil servants in the UK are all good chaps, but sometimes they're not as draconian on regulatory cutback as one would like. Just briefly, a couple of points on tariffs and duty levels. We, at the moment, send 75% of the duties collected in the UK from our business from non-UK shipments to Brussels. So at the moment, there is no revenue impact. If, for example, we were to have zero tariffs, as Minford and et al. Are proposing, which I actually think is a very good idea. And in certain sectors, and obviously this is in the crystal ball of government at the moment, I personally can see no sense, for example, in putting duty on imports of car components, which will only make the UK customer pay more and make it more expensive to export those finished products. And I would say that even if there is no reciprocity from the EU, I think it would still be in our growth and an economic benefit to do those sort of things. I've spoken enough.
Let me come to the floor. I'm going to take 3 questions. So if I could take the lady in the aisle at the back, then this gentleman on the aisle on the other side here, then the gentleman there, and I'll come back for another round. If you wouldn't mind, you've got the microphone, that's terrific. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, madam, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My name is Glyn Evans. I advise a company called Restrata that operates in the security space, but does a lot with very large databases, such as automatic number plate recognition. Now, I notice that Victoria is enormously positive about the practical effects of what is going to come. But I wonder if there shouldn't now be a lot of thought being given as to the impact on HMRC, because technology is going to solve the problems, but the kind of IT systems that are going to be required are massive. And strictly speaking, the government should be going out to tender now, or at least devising and planning those kinds of systems if the ports are not going to seize up. That's where it would seem to me the real problem lies. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman just a few rows ahead on the other side of the aisle, if you could just... Thank you very much. That's great. If you could introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you, James Blitz, Financial Times. 2 very brief questions. The first following on the previous one, really, which is HM Revenue and Customs recently revealed that it was downgrading the state of readiness for the CDS digital system from green, which was go, to amber red, which was the second highest level of concern. How much is that a worry? The chairman of the Treasury Select Committee said there was a collapse of confidence in that system. Alongside that second question, the decision to hold an election does now create a much stronger possibility of a transitional period after March 2019 of at least 3 years. Does that affect the customs issue? Does that mean that you can actually bring things in a more changes in a more graduated way? Or do you still have to have absolute day one readiness on March 2019 because you're either in or out the customs union?
Okay, thank you. And then there's a gentleman just in front of you, if you wouldn't mind passing it on. Thank you, James.
Mild Salteel, Adam Smith Institute. So, to some extent, my questions build on what's already been said. First to Rishi. You've touched on free ports, and the panel has also spoken about the motor industry, and we're aware of the integrated supply lines in that industry as well as also in the aircraft industry. Is there any reason why a free port shouldn't be in such landlocked locations as Cowley or Newbury or Filton? I'd welcome your comments on that. And then this is a question really for Sir David Ord. It's a different way of looking at some of the questions that have already been asked. As an operator of ports, what are your greatest fears as to the logistical problems that you might be facing over the course of the next
Sorry
years,
for the interruption.
immediately after Brexit?
This session has to finish in 3 minutes, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Right.
What would you like the government to be doing?
Let me therefore just... I think there was a gentleman just on the other side, and I'll make this the last... Was it here? Yeah.
Oliver Harvey, Deutsche Bank. I think my question's already mostly been answered, but basically I put it a bit more specifically, which is if the UK was to leave the EU in March 2019 without a transitional deal, how confident are you, this is I guess a question to particularly Victoria and Sir David, that you'd be able to get the logistics in place by March 2019, and when do you need to start the process?
Okay, so let me go along the panellists. A mixture of questions, although a number of them touching on the same points. If the optimism about getting this right is based on the satisfactory and efficient working of a government database, might that optimism be somewhat misplaced? And in particular, is there perhaps now signs that we're less ready than we were previously, not a green light? Intriguing point particularly to Rishi on the free ports. Does this actually need to be drawn on a map, a certain area from a port, or could you pick, I think Cowley was mentioned, a car plant. It happens to be in Oxford, which is about as landlocked as Richmond, North Yorkshire, I think. But, why want to have enterprise zones? Why actually tie them to ports? And then this issue of the general election taking place, does this actually mean one could have a longer, less dramatic exit from the European Union given the political cycle? And would that be a welcome thing, or is that just sort of foot dragging and we should just sort of get on with it and get it all done by March the 29th, 2019, or is it nice to have the breathing space to have another couple of years added onto that in some fashion? Let me go for final thoughts across the panel. Rishi, then Victoria, then Sir David.
Rapid fire. No, you're absolutely right. They don't have to be in landlocked areas. Airports, for example, the West Midlands Airport is interested in the idea, and car plants wherever they may be, especially in this country. I think we import about 75% of auto components and export, I think, about 55% of all the cars that are manufactured. So huge beneficiaries of this kind of idea, and they don't need to be around ports. To the point about systems and infrastructure, I'll defer. The point I would say is, the World Bank's ranked all the countries in the world on how good they are at doing this, and they ranked us 5th out of, I think, 150 odd countries. So, we start in a pretty good place, and of course more investment will be required. Of course we need to get better systems, and it's an opportunity to be best in class. But we're not bad at this. We're pretty good at it to start with, and we need to just make sure we get there in time. And on the election and timing, look, I wouldn't speculate. To be honest, I think if anything, I think it's more likely the extra time that a new 5-year Parliament gives. I would view it as that's more time to actually fully leave the EU and to show that the new systems and things that we have in place have been working for a while before the next election, rather than just deferring the point that we fully leave until 2023. So actually, I think it just gives us breathing room on the other end to show to the country we've fully left. Here are all the new systems in places. It's all working okay, and we're on to better and bigger things.
Victoria, similarly optimistic?
Optimistic but realistic. I think the points about the HMRC IT systems are well made. The downgrading to a red amber status is not as bad as it sounds. That's actually quite common in big IT projects, that these things fluctuate, and in fact something being moved to a red amber just means you have to work harder at it. And I understand HMRC are still confident that their delivery date of January 2019 is still viable, and confident that they'll reach that. However, that said, if that new system isn't up and running and in place and working, then there is no doubt that there will need to be some kind of interim arrangement to stay in the customs union or some other prolongation to keep goods flowing on a quasi-customs union basis. And we've recommended in our report, in fact, that a prolongation of 12 months might be necessary and unavoidable if those systems just simply aren't ready, which is not unthinkable in a government IT project.
David, the final word's yours, and you were particularly asked also about sort of what would Project Fear look like for the ports if you had to end on a pessimistic note. What would be your biggest concern?
We can handle fear. If you have to deal with ship owners around the world, you get pretty used to being put on your mettle. Slightly contrasting, I think we've got to have a date, go for it, and if everybody believes that that is an unalterable date, somehow things always get done. A plea to government, give HM Customs the resources, both in personnel and technology. If the computer works, there will not be a problem. There will be no queues. The logistics industry sector is well used to reacting quickly, to changing processes, to changing procedures. It's all IT driven now. In terms of investment in ports, we're now almost a totally private sector industry. Hardly any quoted companies, if any, in the UK. It's all private equity. They have unbelievable amounts of money to invest. If more storage space is required, more warehouses, that will happen. It will not be a problem.
Thank you. Well, we have slightly overrun our time, although we have made up some time, so I hope that is a model for a brilliantly efficient post-Brexit Britain, that we can make up what we've lost. Thank you to all of our panellists for their, I think, optimistic and upbeat views about what we can achieve, but also a good oversight of the challenges we face. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this session. Please join me in thanking Rishi, Victoria and David.